And Bill and Barry, thank you very, very much, and everybody else who put this event together. I know how much work's involved. And so, ladies and gentlemen, and honorable politicians and my fellow colleagues at ICC, I know there's a number of you here, and certainly our most welcome panelists. Woody, I don't know where you were yesterday. I don't know if it was Miami or California, but this guy jettisons all over the world. And let me first introduce Woody to everybody. I had the pleasure of meeting Woody, I think about 3 months ago. We had a function, maybe it was 4 now, and you were at my home, and he told us this incredible story of passion and working through to actually change an act of Congress. Very few people in their life accomplish what Woody has done. And if you aren't familiar with the Obama Jobs Act that was passed in February of this year, you're going to hear a little bit more about it. And I know everybody's bios are in the program, and because we're a little bit behind time, I'm going to probably just focus in on the actual panel. We also have with us also the president of the CCPPP, which stands for Public-Private Partnerships. And it was interesting reading your bio, Mark, because you were so involved with the Ontario Centres of Excellence. And so it was interesting to see where your stewardship is and kind of in terms of infrastructure, but also you absolutely are brilliant in understanding innovation and the need for commercialization in this country. So the last session talked about the need for bandwidth, and if you remember Arsenio Hall, I mean, we know we need to really improve there. And every time I have a coffee with Bill and I hear about what's going on in other countries around the world, I know that we've really got to rise to that occasion because infrastructure does allow application innovation. We're going to move in this session upstream a little bit, mainly focusing on social media and finance in terms of crowdfunding, and then also talking about the importance of infrastructure. So if I could go to the next slide, please. So I want to just quickly define crowdfunding because many people are familiar with aspects of crowdfunding, if you're familiar with Indiegogo or if you're familiar with Kickstarter, but most people aren't necessarily familiar with the phenomena of social media and finance in terms of equity being able to be acquired through a crowd-based model. We're lobbying very heavily across Canada right now. It's not legal here. We do not have a national securities organization like the U.S. does with the SEC. We certainly have the gift and benefit of hearing from Woody and what he's been doing there. And time maybe later we can talk about other countries are doing around the world. But essentially it's the opportunity where you don't have to be an accredited investor, that you can go on to a secure online portal. The limitations in there in the sense, in Canada, there's discussions underway. The U.S. Are also in discussions. They will be treated typically as a minority shareholder, as a block. And we'll get more into the details on that because that's sort of one of the objectives of the panel. So I'm going to kind of go sit over there, and I'm going to start off with Woody, and maybe just to save time, I'm going to ask the question here because I'm not sure if that mic of mine works yet. So this will be a chance. But so Woody, first question up. There's no question I've heard your passion. I've heard your Herculean energy always. And in many respects, I think you're a gladiator, actually, in disguise. I can imagine you back, in the century of running forward. You're the first out always. And you've been striving to legalize crowdfunding in the U.S. You're not quite there yet. There's no question. But if you could maybe give the essence of the story of what it was like in terms of the Obama's Job Act, but particularly, I think, highlight specifically in kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The fortunate thing, we have this audience. We've got a lot of experts. I think we actually have Norm Betts at the back. I haven't met you, Norm, but Gary said that was you, and he kind of waved at the back. Former Minister of Finance, and also getting involved here in crowdfunding. But why don't you just tell us the good, bad, and the ugly of what all this means?
Okay. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Barry and iCanada for putting on this event. It's exciting to be here. It's exciting to travel around the world and take what we've done in the United States and show the world how they can use our framework actually to implement a similar framework in their countries and create entrepreneurship and innovation and hopefully jobs. I would describe our path as one of unreasonableness, disruption, hope. It's unreasonable to believe that 3 guys who are not lobbyists or lawyers but entrepreneurs that have a successful track record of starting businesses can show up in Washington, D.C. and change an 80-year-old security law, but that's exactly what we did. This law really disrupts the financial system in the U.S. and it allows entrepreneurs to go out and seek up to $1 million of capital a year from their social network. And I think Peter was hitting on that earlier this morning when he was talking about the importance of social media and how we can rely on our community for trust and engagement, not only for their opinions, but now with their money. So that's what our framework does. It also comes with a lot. I mean, it limits investors as to how much they can put in based on net worth or annual income. It's also regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we've got trade industries that are overseeing the entire process. The hope, the last part about it, is because we're not done. As Cindy was saying, when the President signed our bill into law on April 5th, it gave the SEC 270 days to come out with the rules under which this industry would operate. It also gave FINRA, well, the SEC gave FINRA the right to regulate the funding portals. So we believe that they are working in tandem with the SEC right now to come out with those rules. It's very likely that they're going to miss the December 31st deadline. Past behavior is indicative of future performance when it comes to the SEC. That being said, we are engaged with them. They have been very forthcoming. We have been having great dialogue, unlike many other people that show up in Washington, and are hopeful that they are working to get it right. So, yeah.
Well, is this on? Yes, it is. Thanks, Woody. Can we maybe go to the next slide? Thank you very much. We'll just leave that one up there. I've got so many questions I want to ask you, Woody, but I know we've got to be mindful of time. Mark, how are you?
I'm good.
Oh, okay, there you go. Caught you, didn't I?
I wasn't ready for any questions.
Yeah, well, you know.
I thought I'd just sort of talk.
Yeah, well, that's okay. What I'd like you to just chat about is if you could just put in perspective, the recent report that came up, like having just read the World Economic Forum report, which probably many of you here have read, and then reading your report to see, we're doing really quite well in terms of infrastructure capability was really a refreshing moment of reading. So could you maybe just share with us the report card in terms of this area, in terms of the 4 primary asset categories of drinking water, wastewater, stormwater networks, and municipal roads, and any of the other insights in terms of the 3 Ps that you represent well?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
So,
you're quite playful.
I'm not sure if folks have had a chance to look at the report card, but it is a sort of broad look at the state of Canada's infrastructure nationally. And I actually wouldn't share the view that we're in good shape. I think that, B's,
It was your report.
A great report, but that doesn't mean that we're in great shape. I think there are a couple of things which I think everyone would appreciate. Every country in the world is faced with serious infrastructure deficits at the same time as they're trying to address the reality of fiscal constraint. And yet at the same time, we all know that if you don't have new and modern infrastructure, you're in trouble, because it's that infrastructure that gives you or makes that contribution to productivity, economic growth, and all that leads to obviously a more prosperous and globally competitive country, and particularly that's the situation in Canada, and it's the theme, I think, behind the iCanada initiative, which is why we're such strong supporters of it. And so if you're going to try and address the challenge of infrastructure deficit and budget restraint, you really need to look at innovative approaches to how you go about infrastructure development and also public service delivery, and we can talk about that too. And this thing called public-private partnerships is just one of those sort of arrows in your quiver these days. And I think that for politicians in the room, particularly municipal politicians, it's an important arrow to consider. Not a panacea for sure, but when it's right, it is really right. So when we talk about public-private partnerships, what we're really referring to is that collaboration between the public sector, and that could be a level of government or a hospital or a university or college, so it's a public entity turning to the private sector to partner on the delivery of an infrastructure facility. So when I talk about partnering, what we really mean is looking at the private sector as an entity that can take on responsibility for designing, building, financing and maintaining, and in some cases operating the asset over a period of time, usually 30 or 35 years. And that's very different from the sort of standard approach of traditional or conventional procurement of public assets. And what's important here is that it's about these two entities working together in a way that has them share the risks attached to a project, and at the same time allocating the risks in a way so that the entity, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, that's best able to assume that risk is the one that in fact actually does. So when we think about infrastructure, you would expect that the private sector is the one most capable to assume design risk or construction risk. The public sector might be worrying and more able to assume political risk, or in some cases of certain projects, maybe unknown brownfield risks associated with a particular initiative. But it's getting that mix right between the two entities that enables a good, strong partnership to go ahead. And the intriguing part is that while governments may be able to borrow money cheaper than the private sector, the reality is when you think of whole of life costs of a project, the overall cost is actually far cheaper when you move ahead with this kind of long-term asset management project. I have a lot more to say about that, but I'm not sure I've actually touched on your particular question.
No, you've done a great job. There's no question. I think one of the things that I'm teasing here, you guys got to lighten up in this audience. But I think just one of the things, I'm going to try and balance, just because we've got such a short window here. I'm going to take the podium back. When you mentioned kind of that art of the long view of 35-year horizons, we've got quite the dichotomy going here, because we've got infrastructure, there's no question, opportunities for improvement. And the interesting thing here is that you're moving ahead with that kind of long capability. The situation we have here with Woody is, in a sense, our house is on fire, not just in the U.S., but in Canada, in the sense the amount of capital available for entrepreneurs for starting up and seeding ventures. So we've got this compression of time frame here. So Woody, I'm just kind of want to come back to you here for a second here. This is all about creating growth for Americans, in your case, in our case, growth for Canadian startups. Can we get this right?
Well, I don't think we have a choice but to get it right. There's a big difference, and we talk about this a lot in the U.S., about how we got out of recessions in the past by getting capital flowing to the job creators. And in the U.S., 50% of the jobs are created by startups and small businesses. They have access to 1% of the public money available in our markets there. Mm-hmm. So we had no choice but to try and figure out a solution. This is not a problem that is within the borders of the U.S. We have gone to Italy, Colombia, Turkey, here to talk about this. And believe it or not, Italy, struggling more so than many other countries, Spain and Greece right behind them, took our framework and within 3 weeks legalized it. It is now in review with their SEC, and they will most likely be legal with crowdfund investing in Italy before we are in the United States. So what we're realizing is while we have a need for public-private partnerships that have a very long-term opportunity for our countries and what goes on in our communities, what we need to do as entrepreneurs is much more immediate, and we need to figure out how we can get capital to them, because Wall Street and our government has clearly stepped aside. So that's what this framework does. It allowed us to go back to regulations. You have to remember, these regulations were written at a time when the telephone was barely in existence. They served a purpose at the time. People were being taken advantage of through the Postal Service in the United States. That's how fraud was being perpetrated. People were sending letters to people saying, buy this piece of sky out in Oklahoma. It's a really good investment, and they were. Now that we have the social media, now that we have the internet to be able to provide transparency to what's going on, it only makes sense that we update our security regulations. And think about it. This isn't new. We've been making advances and allowing us to do new things like this that ease the way many things happen, not just capital, but look at eBay. Who would have thought that you would send $100 to someone in another part of the country or another part of the world that you never knew before for a product? The fact of the matter is you've got rating systems now that have come out of social media that allow us to feel confident in what we're doing. And so what we've done with the capital markets is really apply these advances in the internet and technology to raising seed and startup capital for small businesses. So it's exciting.
And
Sure.